Hi, good morning, good afternoon, Sec 3s. Welcome to your lesson on communism as a political ideology, as a historical process. Before I start this lesson on communism, please make sure to have your communism worksheet. So you should have this worksheet with you, right? And you should also have your writing materials, so you can take down notes as I go through this lesson. So without further ado, let's explore communism. You know from history class so far that we have explored the history of Russia and how Russia becomes the Soviet Union. And Russia becomes the Soviet Union through a revolution called the Bolshevik Revolution. The Bolsheviks are a group of Russian communists who seized power in 1917 in the midst of World War One. They seized power. They are led by Lenin. They seize power. They establish a communist state in Russia, and that's how Russia becomes the Soviet Union. So, what is this idea of communism? What does it mean? So let's find out. The first and most important sentence you need to know about communism is this quote by Karl Marx. Karl Marx is a German thinker in the 19th century. Karl Marx is a German thinker who's hanging out in French cafes, in Parisian cafes. His ideas are spreading across Europe, and he says, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. Pause the video for a second and think. What does this sentence mean to you? The clearest interpretation is that there is a distribution of abilities. Different people are born into this world with different abilities. Some can swim very fast, some can climb, some can think, some can write. So, in some sense, inequality, right? The difference in abilities is pre-programmed into people as they are born into this world. That might not be a very fair state of things. Why should you be better when you are just when you are born without having had a chance to prove yourself? But at the same time, everyone has needs. Everyone needs food, water, and shelter to survive. And in some sense, a just and fair society should meet the most primitive, most basic, most fundamental, most primal needs of its people: survival. So Karl Marx's idea, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, is really a clarion call for radical redistribution and equality and social equality. He's saying people who are able, who are more skilled, who are able to produce a larger amounts, they should help out the rest of society such that everyone's needs are met. It's a fundamental proclamation of social equality. That is the core idea of communism, and this is a very common symbol of communism. The hammer represents the worker, the sickle represents the peasant. The worker creates industrial goods, the peasant creates agricultural goods. The core idea is that these are the people who are able, they are producing for everyone in society, they are the core group in society, they're the most important group, and we must recognize their leadership. So communism not only talks about social equality, it looks at the producers, the peasants and workers, and recognizes the peasants and workers as the leading group of society. Which is very different if you were to think about it from the modern world. The world we live in now is hardly communist, right? Leaders of society are managers, businessmen, company owners, movie stars, political leaders. These are who we think of as leaders. But in the communist vision, it's those people who are working for the better of society, the workers and the peasants. They are the true heroes. Okay. So we are going to start with the lesson. Society and the state. Can we write this down on the first page of the worksheet? a society is a community of humans living together with an organized political system. So society is really a group of human beings who come together and have some common rules and language and expectations. The state is the main political authority of a society. Is the main political authority of a society, and it has a monopoly of violence. It controls the society. So again, the society is a group of human beings, the group, and the state is the organization that rules over this group. And so you could imagine different types of societies. There could be societies with very weak states, with no states. These are anarchies. There's no government and there's no law. Can you please write down anarchist society on your worksheet, page 1? And then there could be societies with some states that provide for very basic functions like policemen and laws, but don't really do much else. Just make sure that everyone is peaceful, secure, and not shooting each other. So these are minimalist states. Can you write that down on page 1? And finally, you could imagine a society with very high state control, and these are totalitarian states, where the state controls the entire society and everyone is being monitored, surveyed, and manipulated, controlled at all times. So please write these 3 types of states down: anarchy, minimalist, totalitarian. In general, in today's world, most states fall between low and high, somewhere in the middle here. Once you're done, let's move on to page 2. We talked about the core idea of communism. It is social equality. Write that down at the top of page 2. It is social equality. So what does that mean? What does a equal society mean? Well, it means classlessness. So it's not, no one is a noble, no one is a higher rank. Everyone is equal. It's not that some people are commoner and plebeian and hoi polloi and others are noble and aristocratic and king and queen. No, we are all equal. It's a sufficient society where everyone in society has food, shelter, and security. Their basic primal needs for survival are met. People will not starve on the street. And it's a just society, a just society. Just meaning justice, meaning the idea that people who have more, who can do more, will help those who have less, who are less capable and able, through no fault of their own. So to realize this vision, the state must do certain things, right? People don't just naturally become classless. You remove the class from them. People don't just naturally get food and shelter. You provide the food and build the shelter for them. In other words, to ensure social equality, you need a certain high degree of state control, right? For example, the state has to abolish private property. It means that if someone is very rich and the society has classes, right, the state has to eliminate the class by taking away all the rich people's stuff. The state has to provide for its citizens in order for everyone to have shelter. And the state needs to ensure that there's a fair distribution. If people produce more, you take away some and distribute it to people who have less. Already you can see a certain challenge with communism, which is to realize a vision of justice and social equality, you need to intervene and control. Right? And that's why, in general, many communist countries end up as totalitarian states. They end up as states where the government becomes all powerful and has many tools to control its people. So write that down on page 2. Communist states tend to be totalitarian. That's a blank. So let's go back to Karl Marx. We were talking about Karl Marx and his idea of from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. What exactly were Karl Marx's ideas? Well, Karl Marx says there are two ways of dividing the world, and we're going to circle on page 2. One way is to divide the world by countries. So you could circle vertically, circle on your worksheet with a certain color, right? So France is one group, Germany is one group, Austria is one group. So this is called the national principle. Yeah. But Karl Marx thinks there's another way to divide the world. It is by classes. So use a different color and now circle all the kings in one row, circle all the landowners in one row, circle all the bourgeoisie in one row, circle all the proletarians in one row, circle all the peasants in one row. There are two ways of dividing the world, by nations or by classes. And Karl Marx says, why should we divide the world by nations when the real struggle is between classes, right? Why should I care that I'm a Frenchman and a German when in fact, in both France and Germany, the king is taking everything and the peasants have nothing? So let's write down on page 2, vertical division is the national principle, horizontal division is the class principle, and we'll flip to page 3. So Karl Marx thinks that the real struggle is not between nations. When we are fighting wars and fighting conflicts, why should it be France versus Germany? That makes no sense. In the end, inequality is not between nations, it's within nations. So instead, what kind of struggles are the most sensible and productive, thinks Karl Marx, is class struggle. You should get rid of the people at the top and redistribute their wealth to make a more equal and just society. There's a word for this. It's revolution. Karl Marx thinks that there should be revolutions to change and remove the classes. So how does history look like to Karl Marx if we don't think about it as nations, if we think about it as classes? How does history get rewritten? Well, to Karl Marx, there are 6 stages of history. Please pause the video at this point to copy these stages on page 3. So there are 6 stages. There's a primitive society, there's slavery, there's feudalism, there's capitalism, there's socialism, and there's communism. Notice that these stages are not flat, they are progressive. Karl Marx thinks that history progresses and moves in a direction that is upward. In other words, the world is always getting better and better, and the highest point of this evolution is communism. Communism is an ideal final point. It's the best state of history. And we will get there, says Karl Marx, through class struggle. So at every stage, there's a class struggle. For example, in stage 4 of capitalism, the struggle is between businessmen and workers. So according to Karl Marx, the whole world right now is capitalist. There are lots of businessmen and company owners. You can think of some of them, right? Like Tesla, Elon Musk, or Alibaba. What's his name? I forgot. I'll remember. Jack Ma. Alibaba's Jack Ma. Or you could think of Apple, Tim Cook. You could think of Google. Was it Pinchai something? Can't remember. You could think of Facebook, now Meta, which is Mark Zuckerberg. Why should these people be billionaires, trillionaires? Why should Amazon's Jeff Bezos have all the money, right? So these businessmen at the top are always struggling with their workers at the bottom, making the bare minimum to survive. There's this huge gap and they're struggling. And once this struggle plays out, there's a revolution and you move on to the next stage of history. So you keep moving on to the next stage of history, you keep improving, you keep progressing until the final stage where everyone's equal, and that's called communism. So I leave you to read about the different stages and struggles on your own on page 3. I'll simply highlight how struggles happen. So let's give an example. So this is stage 3, feudalism. Under feudalism, peasants plant food and they give it to their lords, their nobles, for security. So the lords protect the peasants and the peasants give the lords food. So from an economic system of agriculture, there's a social system where the lords are on top and they're riding horses and they're nobles and aristocrats, and the peasants and serfs are at the bottom and they plant the potato to give the knight. So there's a economic system that leads to a social system. This social system has two classes. These classes don't like each other, and there will be some sort of class struggle. The serfs will run away from the lords. And because of this class struggle, there will be a new economic system, and you move to a new stage of history where there are factories and mechanized farms. And with this new economic system, you get a new social system. Now you get businessmen and workers. So that's how you go from stage to stage. You have an existing stage, you have a revolution, a class struggle, you get a new stage. In Marxist thinking, the economic system always precedes the social system. Because of certain technological conditions, there are certain jobs in play, and that creates the types of people, the types of classes that exist. Okay, so this is a picture of the Industrial Revolution, which introduced the technology. We can take a look. Yeah, so in this video, okay, the point is that new technology created new economic conditions, which created new social systems, and workers are at the bottom, and businessmen and company owners are at the top, and there are new classes. And this is a meme. The joke is that England, the Industrial Revolution, was full of soot and people were all dirty. It's just a joke. It's not real. It's a stylization. Okay, so we have moved from feudalism to capitalism. And how do you move from capitalism to socialism? Um, this is again another meme. We said that in capitalism, there are businessmen and workers. The Marxian language for this is bourgeoisie and proletariat because remember, Karl Marx is this German guy who's hanging out in Paris, France all the time, and he has all these French words. And so he calls the businessmen bourgeoisie, he calls the workers proletariat. And the point is that these classes are fighting, right? And so the joke in this meme is, the lady asks, "Are there any classes you're struggling with?" She means lessons, and the kid says the bourgeoisie, because he is struggling against them in a class struggle. History joke. Okay. Okay, so you should be on page 4. You can read up about how these stages of history and class struggles are progressing in the Marxian ideology. It's a bit technical. The main idea is that Marx thinks history proceeds by class struggle. The people who have lots and the people who don't have anything will always be fighting. And every time they fight, there's a revolution and history moves on to a new stage. And the final stage of history is communism. Is when people don't own private property anymore. If you don't own property, you can't be rich or poor. If you can't be rich or poor, there are no class divisions and everyone is equal. That's the ideal final stage of social equality. That's a communist society. So Marx had all these ideas, but the person who really started and created the first communist country was not a German. It was a Russian person. And you might know this person, it's Lenin. It's who we have been talking about in chapter 2 of Sec 3 history. It's Lenin. So Marx believed that, right? Marx believed that the workers will rise up and somehow overthrow the businessmen and create a socialist society and then move to communism. The one who actually led the workers to create the first communist state is Lenin. So on page 4, let's look at what Lenin says. Okay, last quote by Marx. I promise, last quote. Marx's idea is that Let the ruling classes tremble at the communist revolution. The proletarians, workers, the workers have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a war to win. This is the last line in the Communist Manifesto. It's the last line of Marx's sort of article asking for all the workers to rise up and fight the businessmen. And of course, Marx is not popular among the businessmen. They all are out for him and he has to go into hiding. And he inspires the Russians. The Russians are very inspired by Karl Marx. Lenin is very inspired by Karl Marx. And Lenin thinks that Marx had great ideas, but Marx was only thinking. Marx wasn't acting. To Lenin, you couldn't just say the workers should rise in a revolution. You had to organize them into a revolution. Because what are workers, right? They're working 16 hours every day at a factory. They're so tired after working at a factory, they have no time to think and read and organize this revolution. Someone has organized them. In other words, Lenin says, the revolution doesn't happen by itself. Someone needs to organize it. History needs a push. So Lenin says, and now we go to page 4, Lenin says that Marx's historical laws are taking too long to happen. You can't just wait for the workers to one day have a random revolution. You have to direct it. And the one to direct it is a party, a communist party. The Communist Party will use this idea of democratic centralism. Democratic centralism means the party will discuss their ideas in the party. It's democratic because they discuss. But once the party has come to a decision, for example, I decide today that we will run a revolution next month, everyone must support the party's decision. So during the discussion, you can have different opinions. But once a decision is made, everyone has to support the same decision. That's how a party can be disciplined and effective. So Lenin really creates a very disciplined, very effective communist party in Russia. And for those of you taking Sec 3 history, you can see how this is setting up towards a very controlling, authoritarian, and totalitarian Soviet Union. It all starts with Lenin's party that's very disciplined, highly controlled. Once the whole party has made a decision, even if you disagreed with it in the past, you now have to support it, fall in line or get kicked out. And the revolution is for the greater good. Lenin thinks you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs, right? You know an omelette, you crack the egg, you mix in the onions, and then you get this really nice egg dish. You had to break the eggs to make the omelette. In Lenin's thinking, you have to sacrifice some people in order to make the beautiful communist state. And that sacrifice is realized in the 1918 to 1921 Russian Civil War, where Lenin's Communist Party causes an entire civil war in Russia just to create his communist state. And he says, that's fine, you had to break those eggs. And we have the 1917 Russian Revolution, where the Soviet Union becomes the world's first ever communist state. So you really can see why the Russian Revolution is a world event, because not only does it change Russia's history, the fact that a communist state is viable, the fact that you can have a communist state, it inspires all the parties around the world. Different communist parties now want to have their own revolution, right? The Hungarians have a revolution in 1919. They established a communist state. The Germans try for a revolution in 1919. They are crushed. The Chinese have a revolution in 1949. China becomes another communist state, and communism is spreading. So it all starts with Russia. This looks like a video. Let's take a look. That's taking too long. Let's move on. Okay, so one historian very astutely pointed out, it wasn't the idea of communism that made Lenin a revolutionary. Because communism, this theory of communism from Marx, is that revolutions happen by themselves. They are natural, they are a law of history. History will progress by itself. No one needs to do anything. The way the world works is that we'll eventually reach the final stage. And Lenin, he says, no, the history is taking too long. We will lead the revolution. We will run a party to direct a revolution and have a civil war. So Lenin made communism revolutionary. Lenin says this idea justifies people organizing revolutions to overthrow governments. And so Lenin had this idea. He ran the revolution, he led the civil war, and he dies. He's succeeded by another Soviet person, not a Russian, a Georgian, called Stalin. And Stalin changes the ideas of communism again. Now Stalin says revolutions can be stopped. They don't need to go on forever. Stalin is coming from a time when Russia has just fought World War One and the Civil War. Russia has been at war since 1914 to 1922 for 8 long years. And Stalin says, enough is enough. We have to stop fighting all these revolutions. So in 1924, Stalin calls for socialism in one country. In other words, the Soviet Union can be communist, but it doesn't have to be communist everywhere else. Why is this such a surprising statement? Because remember, right from the start, we talk about the class principle, national principle, and the class principle. We said that the class principle means that equality is between countries. Workers of the world unite. So when Marx says workers of the world unite, or they have a war to win, workers of the world unite. When Marx says all this, he has this idea that the workers everywhere in different countries should come together and revolution together. It's a world revolution, right? And now Stalin seems to be going back to the national principle. He's saying, just one country is enough. Don't care about the rest. So Stalin is changing Marx's ideas. This is not something Marx would have agreed with. And for those of you who know your Russian history, Trotsky is against this, but Trotsky loses the argument and is expelled. So let's copy down on page 4. You can encourage more revolutions using your secret agents, but as a country, focus on yourself first. That's what Stalin says. This is called socialism in one country. The Chinese have their own ideas. The Chinese and the Vietnamese. Because the Chinese and the Vietnamese in Asia believe that their conditions are different. Specifically, they have very few workers and many peasants. So the way they want to do it, because they have few cities, few workers, many peasants, the way they want to do it is talk about the peasants. So in other words, on page 4, the peasants in China will lead the revolution. So Mao Zedong changes the ideas of communism from Stalin again. Mao Zedong says, not the workers, but the peasants. And he applies his ideas in the 1949 Chinese Revolution. So on page 4, the last line, the 1949 Chinese Revolution. China becomes a communist country when Mao Zedong's peasants rise up and wins another civil war. So Mao Zedong also has his own Chinese civil war that lasts for 4 years after World War II. So it's like World War One, Russian Civil War, World War II, Chinese Civil War, and Mao Zedong wins. So we'll summarize. We have these 4 men. We have Marx, who says workers of the world unite. We have Lenin, who says the party leads the revolution, not history, not natural, but people. The party must come together and lead a revolution. We have Stalin, who says socialism in one country. And we have Mao Zedong, who says don't just focus on the workers. In Asian countries, you need the peasants. And so it goes from Marxism to Marxism-Leninism to Marxism-Leninism Stalinism to Marxism-Leninism Stalinism Maoism. So the idea of Marxism sort of evolves and changes according to its country that it's applied to. So take this down on page 5. And now that you have learned all this, on page 6, you should map out these concepts in a concept map. You should map out these concepts on page 6. Use 10 of the ideas, try to figure it out for yourself. Or if you need to, look back on the video, see what I've gone through. The last page of these notes are some excerpts from the Communist Manifesto, the original document written in 1848. And of course, the most important line is the final line: workers of the world unite. Marx is asking for a revolution. The one who creates it is Lenin. Finally, returning to the hammer and sickle, I think you now understand why the symbol of communism is a hammer and a sickle. The hammer represents the workers, the proletariat that Marx says will rise up, the workers whom Lenin will organize in his party to run the 1917 Russian Revolution, or the workers who form the backbone of Stalin's Soviet Union, and the sickle, which represents the Asian communist countries, China and Vietnam, who whose peasants support the Communist Party to win their respective civil wars: the 1945 to 1949 Chinese Civil War, the 1955 to 1975 Second Indochina War, the Vietnam War. Communist states all around the world look at these classes, the workers and the peasants, as the backbone. And what is the significance of knowing communism? Why does communism matter as a world historical force? So the Second World War ends in 1945 with two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. And these superpowers have different political and ideological systems. The United States has a democratic capitalist system. It believes that businessmen and a free market run a very smooth economy. It does not believe in radical social equality. On the other end of the spectrum, the Soviet Union has absorbed the ideas of Marxism. The Soviet Union is a communist state, and the Soviet Union sees the ideas of communism spreading around the world. So in the late 1940s, a rivalry emerges between the United States and the Soviet Union. And the groups of countries they come to lead in the world are called, firstly, the First World, led by the United States, and the Second World, led by the Soviet Union. It is this geopolitical, ideological rivalry between the First World and the Second World that is what comes to be known as the Cold War. The Cold War. So you see the blue here is the First World countries. The red here is the Second World countries. What is the Third World? The Third World in green are countries that consciously try to stay out of the Cold War, right? But somehow still get sucked in at the end of the day. And the Cold War only ends in 1991 when the Soviet Union dissolves. So for a good 50 years, the world is defined by this competition, this rivalry, this Cold War between First and Second Worlds. It is defined by the emergence of communism that began in 1917 in Russia and spread around the world and led to a degree of competition and conflict to the point where a leader of the Soviet Union, Khrushchev, was so confident as to tell the Americans, "We will bury you because our ideas of communism are superior and are the real final stage of history. Communism will be the winner of this competition." He was wrong. Communism failed and the Soviet Union dissolved. But communism was a very powerful idea and remains a very powerful idea. And why did it fail? We'll find that out in Sec 4 history. So that's the end of my lesson today on communism.